Hi, I'm Peter Centoscano, host of Citizens Climate Radio. We highlight people's stories, we celebrate your successes, and together we share strategies for talking about climate change. We do all this by hearing from some pretty surprising climate advocates. We feature politicians, preachers, and poets. Citizens Climate Radio is designed to inform you about the many ways people are addressing the causes and impacts of climate change. Subscribe and listen to Citizens Climate Radio wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome to Climify, the podcast that connects climate scientists and design educators together so that we can help combat our climate crisis in our classrooms. The discussions on this program are geared to help you climify your syllabi to assign projects that not only teach design fundamentals, but also can have a positive impact on our climate.
This episode is brought to you by Renourish. Renourish is your one-stop online resource for sustainable design and systems thinking strategies and tools for the graphic designer. You can learn more about Renourish on their website at renourish.org, or you can follow them on Twitter and Facebook at Renourish.
So I'm Steve Nesbitt. I'm a professor of meteorology and atmospheric sciences at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where I've been at the last 16 years. And I focus on understanding extreme weather processes in the atmosphere and how they relate to weather and climate around the world. And you can learn more about my research at swnesbitt.com.
That was Stephen Nesbitt. He's a professor of atmospheric sciences at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. That's also where I work. He's a colleague of mine that I met a number of years ago, and I invited him to one of my design classes probably around in 2016 or so. He came as an expert to help out with the sustainability course I was teaching, and as much as he educated the students on the topic of climate change, I think he also scared them just a little bit. He's always been a gracious and friendly colleague, and I'm just happy that he had an hour to join me on this program today. So one thing you will notice, though, unfortunately, is that when we recorded this back in June of 2022, it just so happened that Steve and I share the same internet provider, and they were doing some work that day on their system. So there's some moments of Zoom lag, that sort of hiccup in the voices. And so you'll hear that here and there. At some point during the recording, it actually completely dropped off. Through the magic of editing, you won't hear that part, but you're going to hear a few hiccups. I apologize for that. But I still think that this is a really good discussion I had with Professor Stephen Nesbitt. Well, welcome, Steve. Thanks for coming on the show. I'm excited to see you again. For my listeners, I have met Steve many times before, and he's always been a good person, always been someone who very available and willing to lend his expertise. So thanks for coming on here, Steve.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have a couple questions for you, as you know, right? So I wanted to get into a little bit about first you and what led you to the work that you're doing. Why did you get into climate? Why meteorology? Why all of that?
Yeah, so you may, for those of you that are in meteorology or have a meteorologist in their family, you find that a lot of people in our field tend to have a certain genetic disposition to the environment or meteorology. In the field, we call it being a weather weenie.
A weather
and
weenie?
It turns out a weather weenie.
Okay.
So these are people who, you can find them. These are people, for me, it was the kid who had a ring gauge in their backyard when they were 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Just people who, for some reason, the weather just clicks to them, and they kind of have this sort of sense of connection with what's going on in the daily weather or climate. Well, these people actually end up going into culture believe it or not, I think, and or they end up becoming a meteorologist or a climate scientist. And you'll find a lot of us out there in that disposition. So for some reason, I think there's this natural human connection to our environment. And for those of us who, for whatever reason, got interested in the challenge of predicting things like weather and climate, this was just a career that kind of became natural to us. So for me, I grew up outside of Buffalo, New York, a place which is kind of infamous for its severe snowstorms that happen.
Snowstorm. I was going to say snowstorms.
Yes. So for us, it was always the challenge of how much is it going to snow, and was school going to be closed the next day?
Oh,
So
snow days. Yeah.
Snow days, right?
Yes.
So for those of us that got to have snow days, I guess our kids will not necessarily have them going forward with virtual schooling, which is just terrible. Yeah. It was always that challenge, like, well, how much was it going to snow and why? So I got into that when I was a kid, and I started out, people our age, we kind of got to be teenagers, and the Weather Channel became a thing on cable, which kind of just fed the beast, if you will. And
are we both Gen X? Is that?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I think so.
So, we grew up with cable, and the Weather Channel was always one of the 26 channels you could get.
Right. I remember those days.
Yeah. And, during that time, the Weather Channel was just wall-to-wall weather. They would cover extreme events all over the country, hurricanes, tornadoes. They'd be live wherever. And that just became something that was a real interest to me. And, it wasn't until high school that I really understood, taking an earth science class, that this was actually a career where you could do more than just be on TV. Because you can probably tell with this interview, I'm not somebody who would be very good on TV. But research, became an option, and teaching, and that kind of made up my mind that I either wanted to become a kind of behind the scenes forecaster, or somebody who does the research. And as college went on, it became clear that I could handle the research and computing aspects of things, and the rest is history.
I guess so, right?
Yeah.
And here we are, the pinnacle of your career, right here.
Yeah. No, so it's interesting, once I got into academia, you really benefit from having good mentors. And I was fortunate that I was taken under the wing of a senior scientist who was basically one of the most decorated people who does observational meteorology out in the field.
Yeah.
So his name is Ed Zipser. He's now mostly retired, but he just celebrated more than 50 years in doing observational meteorology. Was one of the first people to take instrumentation out to the tropics and measure a lot of the climate relevant processes that are going on in remote areas, after World War II. And it became, I've got under his wing and got the opportunity to do these kind of things and actually go observe the weather all over the world. And I've been involved in, I think, 22 field campaigns over my career, all over 5 continents. So it's just been amazing to go out and actually take measurements of the phenomenon that comprise what our climate system is. So that's what I do. I basically go out and look at that drive weather and climate around the world.
Now, you, just for full transparency, you've been in my class before. You came a couple years ago, and you shared with my students who were working on a design and I think ethics project, probably a really focused presentation about your work, which I actually learned a lot about. Would you mind telling that again? Like your work with clouds. I think you said you were doing a lot of work in Mexico with this.
Yeah. So I've done work in Mexico, and recently we did a big project in Argentina, which is a place where clouds really drive extreme fluctuation in weather, and that's all related to the long-term climate and eventually how climate change will impact that region, which is a really important breadbasket of the world. So clouds are really kind of the lens that controls how the sun interacts with the land surface and the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
So they kind of act as a mostly a cooling shade for us. They reflect a lot of this incoming solar radiation. Therefore, if the cloud cover ends up changing with a changing climate, that could actually turn up a thermostat on the Earth's climate system. And in addition, of course, it's where water is delivered to land, right? So the oceans drive the water cycle. Water vapor comes over the land, and the clouds are the agents that actually dump the precipitation on land. So
I remember in when you were talking with my students, this is something I didn't know. Based on what you were just saying, like the clouds that are like lower, closer to the land, they're more important for blocking than the higher. Did I remember that right?
Yeah, that's correct. You're spot on. So
see, I learned. You taught me.
yeah. The low clouds. I mean, these are the clouds. If you look at a satellite picture, they comprise a very high fraction of the cloud cover on the planet. Especially if you live in Seattle, this. They're always there.
Yeah.
But they extend all the way offshore over the Pacific Ocean. A lot of the cooler ocean areas, they're covered with these clouds. And so that reflection piece that I talked about, that is what basically these warm clouds that are low in the atmosphere. These are the ones that are very responsible for that reflection, but then they're also sensitive to changes in temperature. So as the climate warms, there's a lot of research now that's showing that these clouds are going to start to be frequent, and that would lead to a feedback, we call it.
The feedback
loop. Right. So as you warm, you decrease these clouds, and it leads to a contribution to more warming, which is something we don't want to have happen.
That sounds like things get worse, basically.
Yes.
Okay. So when listening to this program, respect those low-lying clouds that are out there. They're very helpful.
When you have that cloud in the summertime and you're like, darn it, I wish it was hot and sunny. Actually, those are keeping the climate system cool when they happen.
Is it that you're seeing in a specific part of the world that's already happening, that these clouds are dissipating?
Yeah, there's some evidence in the observational record that off the west coast of North America, kind of off the southwestern part of California, that there's some evidence that those clouds are decreasing already, and we'll maybe see that going forward.
So with that work, with the work that you're doing in specifics, have you thought about how that story can be told better than it is being told right now? Because I imagine a lot of people listening to the show, they don't know that, but it seems to be pretty common knowledge for most climate scientists.
Yeah, this is the grand challenge, right? Because ultimately, our scientific results are going to inform policy, and policy gets involved in politics. And unfortunately, we end up with kind of mixed messaging when you start making that transition, because obviously we can't write down equations in front of the general public and go through our
bunch of math on the screen.
Never
works.
That's not going to work. Doesn't even work in our talks, right? So it's one of those things where we have to try to make those connections. And we as scientists, we published the IPCC report to try to make a statement for policyholders or policymakers, excuse me, to have those documents where they can have a scientific basis to write policy on. Of course, the way Washington works is that you have experts and think tanks who further sort of contort this into a policy.
Right.
And then you have the public sphere of debate, which, of course, politicians are maybe listening to or maybe not. So as a scientist sitting kind of at the bottom end of this pyramid ultimately changing policy and informing things like the Paris Climate Accords, it can be definitely a challenge. And
I'd say so.
So I think, things that we can do obviously are do things like this and hopefully reach a broader audience, and try to convince those that, may be on the fence, although of course with the polarization that we have now, it's very difficult to find the undecided voters, if you will,
Right.
because of the kind of the muddy waters that are out there when it comes to, changing the opinions of people. So I think that one aspect is just more communication. The other important aspect, of course, is trying to understand how extremes in climate and weather connect to the story of climate change.
Yeah, that's important.
Right? Because people pay attention as, communities impacted by a hurricane or by a tornado or a flood or a drought, right? These are things that people actually feel. Fortunately or unfortunately, the press, also likes to use this as an opportunity to kind of share these messages. Although the science usually is not very clear in these particular cases about attributing certain events to specific aspects of climate change.
So the press will generalize as opposed to be
Right.
very clear and specific.
Right. And the analogy that I like to say is, for example, if you're playing a gambling game and a dice is loaded,
Right.
right, and climate change is certainly loading the dice for certain events, it's hard to say for one specific roll of the dice that you won or lost that game because of that loaded dice, right? The probabilities are shifting. So in the long run, if you roll the dice 1,000 times, yes, you will be able to attribute the statistics of that outcome to that shift. But for one event, I mean, for example, you still may get a bullseye or not, but over the long run, if we keep shooting those darts, good outcomes, right? So that nuance is hard to explain, I think, and unfortunately, it's hard to directly make that causation.
But there's some good visuals in your metaphor there, right? Because most of my listeners are in the world of visual, right? That
Right.
we make things that are visual. So I think there's some opportunities with collaboration here where I invited you to my class, right? Someone at another university can call up their resident climate scientist into their class. There's usually more than one, but working with that sort of metaphor that you described is in my head, it's very visual, like loaded dice, playing darts, to help maybe tell this story or a series of stories to the audience that you want to reach. That audience part, I think, is really important because you mentioned, people on the political spectrum, usually on the right, are, would you say, less likely to be believing in this?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of different decisions that people make based on sort of personal risk that they assess and also their own vision of certain outcomes that may happen to them, right? And the other analogy that I like to think of is, for example, smoking, right? There's direct evidence that if you smoke, you have a very high risk of lung cancer, right?
Right.
But people still smoke.
That's true.
People
That's
make
true.
that decision in light of incredible odds, like 1 out of 5 people are going to get lung cancer, I believe. But for some reason, they continue to do it, and that's how they decide to do it, right? And I'm not going to sit here and judge them about that, but those are the kinds of things we have to deal with when politics are involved. I think people kind of lose sight of maybe what they might expect the outcome to be, and it becomes a little bit more difficult to, once the whole complexity of the political spectrum becomes very polarized, it becomes very difficult to kind of unplug certain issues that way. And I think a lot of social science research shows that there's not, you kind of lose the ability to make change once you've kind of politicized these things.
Yeah, before we started recording, you mentioned you were getting hate mail, or you got some hate mail or mean
Definitely
messages.
some mean social media. Yeah.
I'm sorry for that. I have not yet, so crossing my fingers. But I mean, I do you think that the people that are sending those, they could be bots, right? We're not sure, but is it worth still trying to tell the story to those people who are in that category?
Oh, I think absolutely. I mean, even though you have the person that may be a troll bot or actually somebody who truly believes uh, that science is some sort of agenda,
Right.
right?
all you wealthy scientists who
Yeah,
are
we're definitely being we're on Putin's paycheck and all this stuff. Yeah. No, this is it's a challenge, but the halo effect is, if the arguments are out there in public, people can read them, and if they are seeking reason, they should be able to see, who's on what side here, and get through the rhetoric of, seeing, why do people really oppose the idea of,
Mhm.
doing some very relatively minor things to potentially save the planet. Um, the idea that we can just continue to do what we've done forever is not really backed up by any sort of human history.
True.
We've faced a lot of challenges as a human race, and our species has adapted. We've fortunately been in a period in the last couple hundred years where we've had very stable climate. We've had very plentiful energy, and that's borne out to be a lot of success in extending human life, and it's all great. But that doesn't mean that any change is necessarily going to reverse all that. And I think people are
Right.
scared, right? They're
Change is
scared
hard.
they're scared that if I can't, drive my huge pickup truck at 80 miles an hour whenever I want, then somehow my life's going to get worse.
Right.
I just don't see that. So I think that technology is going to save us in the end, which is good. But it's also going to take some political will to say, okay, well, let's think about what's sensible here,
Mhm.
and make some reasoned decisions.
That statement about technology will save us. Is there something that we don't, or or is there some technology that you're excited about that you think will be a big
Yeah,
factor here?
yeah. I mean, we're already seeing solar, wind, and I know nuclear is controversial, but for example, in the state of Illinois, where we reside, the majority of electricity is generated by those three sources,
That's good to hear.
right? So
Yeah.
it's certainly possible already to do this. Um, and so I think, we can push in those directions. And, the idea that distributed solar is taking on huge parts of, electricity market now. You see it popping up everywhere.
Can you define
Uh,
that for me? Distributed solar?
yeah, distributed solar is where you have solar panels on your own house.
Oh,
And
okay.
and you can take that energy directly. Also, we're seeing solar farms developing, and the price and efficiency of solar is really becoming to the point where it's cheaper even than nuclear energy. And we've seen that
I've read that.
nearby
Yeah.
here. They've threatened to shut down our nearby nuclear plant because it's not cost effective anymore.
Mhm.
So that's all good news, and also society has become a lot more efficient. Um, you know, some of that's because of past energy crises, but also because of technology, uh, and better building practices. And as we go forward, that's all going to continue. So the good news is that we're headed in the right direction. We're not headed fast enough in that direction yet,
Okay.
but I think we can get there as long as we have the political will to get there. And I think, as we go through this energy crisis, perhaps one good outcome could be that those decisions become a little bit more towards the forefront.
Yeah, because it does seem by all the press releases that I'm reading about car companies, by X year, we're going to have our entire fleet being electric. Even some of the pickup trucks, right, that you mentioned.
Right.
Ford, I think, this is not a commercial for Ford, but they're coming out with one next year, I believe.
There's several companies that are developing new electric vehicles and trucks. There's a lot of work in the marine industry to make shipping more green by changing the fuel mixtures. And also, the industry is going to be another big challenge. But, these are things that we can work on. We need to obviously do this here, but we also need to do this around the world and make sure that all the developing countries follow a greener path than we did when we became industrialized. So making sure this technology is licensable and available around the world so that we can have a greener future.
Well, on that hopeful thought, we're going to take a few moments to hear some messages from our sponsors.
Most of us know what we need to do to help the planet, like more solar, trees, and more bicycles. But even the best of us can get pretty stuck with figuring out how we motivate and inspire millions of people and governments around the world to adopt change. But there is a way. My name is Katie Patrick. I'm an environmental engineer, a designer, and an author, and I interview expert PhD researchers from top universities around the world like MIT, Harvard, and Stanford about the psychology of environmental action. And I put these interviews out on my podcast called How to Save the World. I'm inviting you to join me on this wild intellectual journey into the heart of the environmental psyche so that we can unearth these fascinating and critical teachings we can use in our climate campaigns, programs, designs, and startups. You can find my podcast, How to Save the World, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and at anchor.fm/Katie Patrick.
Okay, we're back, Steve. I wanted to get into some more meaty, although that what we talked about before was pretty meaty, but meaty for designers questions. One of the themes this year, on this season, I should say, is about the story of climate change, the concept of rebranding it or retelling that story and how designers can be part of that. I sent you all these questions before, so you've had some time to think about it, but have you thought about that even in your own work and with the work that you do, how you could tell that story better, how someone like me or people listening to the show from a design perspective could help you just get your story more clear to more ears, more eyes?
Yeah, no, this is a really good question, and
Thank you.
it goes out to how our work can be more impactful, and how climate really kind of hit the road in terms of how people make choices, what's appealing, and really impacts a lot of the the basic culture of our nation and the world. For a long time, we've had this vision, since the post-World War II era of how urban versus suburban lifestyles are appealing to people. And the science tells us that low density development, for example, is very bad for climate because it requires more transportation, and it's also not good for our health. So I think where design can come in is try to make spaces for people to be more comfortable sort of in the in that urban space, the high density space, so that we can reach some of these climate goals. Technology can only get us so far, but the basic idea of transporting everybody around hundreds of miles per week is really not going to work no matter what we do. Right. So
better urban planning, right?
Right. So how do we take spaces and make them more appealing in that urban sort of framework for people to be able to live in those spaces.
Mhm.
I think that's sort of, in terms of sustainability goals, we're going to have to get there. And so how do we make that appealing to people? Obviously, the other part of it is housing supply.
Right.
But people need to make those choices in order for the market to be able to support people to live in those spaces. So urban planning, I think, is part of it, and telling that story effectively to people about, maybe the choice of living out, tens or even 50 miles from where you work or where you go to school is not going to be all that great.
Being a hermit out on a farm somewhere maybe isn't the best for climate.
Yeah. Well, as long as you stay out there, it's fine. But
Oh, right.
if
Yeah.
you are,
Driving
if
into
you're,
work. Right. Yeah.
yeah, if you're driving long distances,
Commuting.
yeah. So that's, I think, part of it. Also, I mean, a lot of the reason I think people see that as appealing is they have this idea that somehow, education and cost of living will be lower. But
Cost of living might be, but
yeah,
education,
well,
yeah,
if
you don't
if
know.
you add up all the costs of transportation, I don't think it really is. I mean,
That's true.
you know, it just depends on how you want to spend your money. So I think and really making the urban space seem desirable to people, I think is a big challenge for
Hmm.
in the big cities in the US. You have New York, who will trump up, uh, you know, a fantastic place to live. You have everything right around you, and certainly, that's a lifestyle that's great. But what do you do in your medium-sized cities,
Right.
right? So where you don't have, all the entertainment and park space and greenery and everything else that you have in a place like New York. So
Hmm.
so how do you do that? How do you take places like Houston and kind of flip the script and turn a kind of a bedroom downtown into a place where people want to have a vibrant urban center?
Yeah, because living more vertically is, from a climate perspective, better than living spread out horizontally. That's what I remember hearing.
Yeah, it's totally. I mean, it saves not only just transportation but also energy, distribution, everything else. It's kind of a exponential effect that if you can, people in New York City use a much lower carbon footprint than
Hmm.
people in the rest of the world. And if you think about Canada, for example, we think, oh, Canada is more progressive and so forth, but they have actually more carbon challenges than we do because their urban
Really?
centers are very spread out.
Oh, wow, I didn't know
Uh,
that.
yeah, so they, it's just whether you're commuting long distances and live in a single family house where all the energy that you're using to heat your and cool your place is all right there and you lose it all.
Well, it does sound like there's some opportunities here also from awareness for policymakers to think about,
Mhm.
I'm thinking about living in Chicago because that's close to us. I don't think I could afford it, right? I mean, on my
Right.
salary here. I mean, design educators, like climate educators, don't make gobs of money. But it sounds like there's an opportunity here for awareness to policymakers about um, cost of living adjustments to encourage people to think about moving to the city.
Right, because I mean it goes into a lot of our policy, right? We all buy single family homes primarily because it's we get a huge tax uh,
Exactly.
incentive, right, to do so. So how does our tax system, in terms of space that we live in, relate to climate goals?
Mhm.
And I think there are some proposals out there to think about how we might, change that. I've heard about a land tax where you, instead of taxing the building on land, you actually tax just the land,
Right.
and that would encourage, return of land to, agriculture or native space rather than building
It's
out
interesting.
parking lots, out for.
Yeah, for sure. And if you had a big
for acres and
vertical
acres.
condo building, the actual footprint of the land is fairly small. So you divide that up by hundreds of inhabitants and the taxes are much lower.
Right, right. So it just depends on how we want to prioritize, the within our tax system and how that relates to our climate goals.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm wondering too, then, still on the design track here, if this question I asked to everyone, and that is, if you were in my shoes, you're teaching a design course, you're in a design educator's shoes, uh, what would you do as a project or a class connected to your work? Like it could be your dream dream scenario.
Yeah. So another aspect we didn't really think of, and it kind of relates to urban design, but also kind of architecture, is, how do we build climate resilient communities
Mm,
from an urban design or from a design standpoint? And there's another area of our research which is done. There's some research on our campus in the civil engineering department about how we design buildings, not only just their sort of structure, but also their distribution, and how that relates to resilience to weather and climate extremes. So for example, um, if you have really uniform space buildings that are relatively close together, it turns out that sort of mitigates the effects of tornadoes
no.
on the design, because you can't build up really strong winds in the distribution, between those buildings.
So
So
Kansas would love this.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But even here, in the Illinois, where we do see this, there's a severe tornado that went through the suburbs of Chicago recently, about 2 years ago, 2020.
Yeah, I think you're right. I remember reading about that.
It turns out that if you look in where we have cul-de-sacs in urban environments, those are terrible, because you've got one house sitting at the end of this huge canyon of wind between the houses,
It's like a wind tunnel.
like a wind tunnel. And even though cul-de-sacs are nice and private, that house right on the end of the cul-de-sac, they found, was really statistically dangerous in terms of
You don't want to buy that house.
you don't want to buy that house. So we used to design houses, neighborhoods with straight streets, and they'd be gridded, and it turns out that that's much more resilient to strong winds, because you don't
That's
have these
interesting.
high risk areas. So from a sort of a planning perspective, it's interesting to think about how the environment and the sort of layout of homes or businesses within the city can be resilient or not, depending on those designs.
That's a cool project, like thinking
yeah.
about designing a climate resilient town from scratch.
Yeah, what sort of green space would you like to allow? Green space is really good for avoiding heat waves, because it reduces the amount of the sun's energy that can go into sensible heat, which is what raises the temperature. So evaporating water is usually a good thing. So you want to have water and green space, but obviously the more you put that in, the more transportation that you need to
True.
account for, because you get lower density development. So some people have talked about putting in like little canals even down each street, where instead of routing
Like Venice.
Yeah, right. So instead of routing stormwater underground, you actually route it into little, water channels that go
That's
through
fun.
the cities. Yeah, and you could have little boating opportunities if you wanted to, but this can help make urban areas a lot more resilient to heat waves, which will probably be increasing in the future. So
Like, I agree. Yeah, like right now
yeah.
it's 100 degrees here in Illinois in June, which I think is a record for this early in the year.
Yes. Yeah. So we'll be feeling it here in the next few days. And, one of the reasons why it's going to be so hot is that the corn is not developed, and it's also been dry. So
Mhm.
this is like the perfect storm of a heat wave, is when you have a kind of a dry lead up, and then you get a lot of heat in the atmosphere.
Just kind of as an aside to that, but connected, the Midwest where we are, right? What is sort of like in your research, like predicting forward about in particular the Midwest in the US, for how it's going to change or adapt to climate.
Yeah. So like I just mentioned, we all complain about how humid it is around here.
Yes.
It turns out that is a great buffer for heat waves. So
Good.
if you look at the historical record, a lot of the United States has warmed in the last century, but we have not. And a lot of the summertime extreme temperatures that they've experienced down in the southern plains
Hmm.
have not translated here because of the hundreds of miles of developed agriculture that we have around here. So fortunately, in the wintertime, we've seen much warmer temperatures. That's going to continue, and that's really not kind of that great, because it leads to problems with our ecosystems and pests and things like that. But fortunately, in the summertime, we should be in relatively good shape compared to other places in the country.
The Midwest is best.
Yeah. So Midwest and Great Lakes, if you look at kind of a ranking of climate resilience in the United States, we're actually in decent shape here. Doesn't mean that we'll be, experiencing more drought potentially,
Hmm.
or heavy precipitation events. I think that's pretty clear that's
That still happens
in the
here.
cards. Yeah, that's going to be in the cards for us, and it could increase. Those events could increase in the future, according to a lot of research, although there's some uncertainty in that.
Sure.
But we, from a design perspective, we need to think about, how these changes could impact our design landscape going forward, and how, how our choices that we make could possibly feed back into that. And just to kind of the final thing on that question, we're working on a project in Chicago to kind of optimize some of these things. So in Chicago, obviously, we have huge inequities in terms of social sort of status in different regions.
Hmm.
And we're kind of asking the question about what we could do to kind of retrofit Chicago to make the climate outcomes more equitable, right?
Hmm.
And it turns
That's
out,
important.
right, there's a lot of overlap between where the worst heat waves are, where the worst flooding is, and where, unfortunately, the socioeconomic status is challenged the most. And
Race and
so, right,
socioeconomics are most
right.
affected.
So, one could argue that was accidental or not,
Well,
but it's
it
the
probably
reality
was
that we
not,
have.
based
Yeah,
on the history I've read. Yeah.
yeah. The the state of the current situation is that this is the reality. So how could we go in and change that? And so, our green roofs, and planting more trees in certain neighborhoods,
Hmm.
paving, digging up parking lots and urban sort of wastelands that have been paved around factories that are no longer in use. Can that have an actual measurable impact on these things? And also, when we do that, what benefits do we see for human health? And so hopefully within the next 5 years, we'll have the answer to some of those questions with our project.
I hope so. Yeah, we've clocks ticking right on all of this stuff.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's important, right, in your project and in any project that designers undertake, to include as many voices as we can, and speaking to those communities in Chicago that are most affected. I mean, they probably know they're affected, but they may not know everything about how and why they're affected. Is that what you're finding?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we're engaging some of the neighborhoods in kind of the south side and west side of Chicago, and we have community leaders that have given us very much the rundown of how they're affected by extreme events and
Wow.
what that means for their day-to-day lives in terms of just the effects of flooding and the aftermath on disease. Even in the United States, there are regions where water quality and flooding of public spaces and even homes lead to things like mold and
Oh yeah.
other insect-borne diseases. And so if we can hopefully mitigate some of those things under this sort of the idea that these events could be more frequent in the future, I think will help us with policies.
Is this particular project online anywhere, like in progress, or?
Yeah, it's in the proposal stage right now, but it's called Crocus, and there's a website that I think people can go to. But it's one of the Department of Energy.
Crocus, Crocus.
And people can learn a little bit more about it. Hopefully, Department of Energy is funding a lot of these urban sort of energy climate interaction studies, and hopefully ours is selected, but we'll hopefully get it funded either one of these ways, because it's a really important problem for Chicago.
And you might need some design help.
Yeah.
So well, thanks, Steve. This has been a very educational conversation for me. I learned a lot about not only the work you do, but just basic climate stuff. I obviously learned a lot when you came to my class. So that's sort of my message for the listeners, is invite Steve or other climate scientists on your campus to your classroom. Steve, where can we find you again online before we depart today?
Yeah, you can find me at my website at swnesbitt.com, or on Twitter at 70_DBZ, which is a very extreme radar echo for a storm.
Well, thanks, Steve. It's been a pleasure talking with you today, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Take care.
This podcast is written, produced, and engineered by me. Designed by Bashul Rashik and Mark O'Brien, with music by Casual Motive. Next week on Climify, we're joined by Gabrielle Marit, the perfect blend of environmental scientist and data visualization designer.
I think I was always interested in science, and that's definitely part of the science field, but also I was raised in the countryside. And so I had this appetite for, trees, and we always have animals. And I became vegetarian quite early on, because when you see the animals you're about to eat and you grow up with them, you have this different approach. So I think there was this education around respect of nature and connection to nature. And also when it comes to data, there's plenty of data, but I was interested in data that connects to human beings. And really, when it comes to climate, it's really just the emergency of the century. So it's like, it's everywhere. You cannot talk about anything without talking about climate. So I think that's how it worked out. So it was a lot of my work involved climate science.
Thanks for listening to Climify. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. To catch all the latest on Climify, you can follow us on Instagram at Climify Podcast. Climify is part of Climate Designers. Learn more at climatedesigners.org/edu.